Welcome to the Magdalene Voices, giving voice to those silenced for centuries through sacred conversations with beautiful, illuminating souls. I am your host, Mariaestela, and I am joined today in this inaugural show of the Magdalene Voices by my dear friend and well-renowned American mystic Trisha McCannon. Tricia is a mysteries expert. She's an author, she's a teacher, and she's a keynote speaker. Her work is deep and broad, and you can find out much more about Tricia on her website, TrishaMcCannonSpeaks.com. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to my dear friend, Trisha McCannon, in this inaugural show of the Magdalene Voices. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Magdalene Voices. My name is Mariaestela, and I am your host. And today, in this inaugural show, I am joined by renowned mysteries expert Tricia McCannon. And welcome, Tricia. And first of all, I want to say a very big, warm welcome, but also a great big thank you for being here for this inaugural show. It is my pleasure to have you, and I hope that this show may serve those who both either see or hear it.
Thank you so much, Maria, for having me. It's a pleasure. I know you're in Denmark, and I'm over here in Atlanta, and don't you just love that the internet allows us to have a worldwide audience of people who are interested in these mysteries and interested in the return of the Christ in both its male and its female form. And we're very blessed, and it's a pleasure to be on the Magdalene Voices. I know this is one of many successful, great shows you're going to be doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the reason why I actually wanted to have you on as my very first guest is because I read your book, The Return of the Divine Sophia, and was immediately pulled into the teachings that you put forth in this book. And I know that those are not basically your teachings, but they're coming through you. And you're speaking about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and also Isis. And this show, The Magdalene Voices, is going to be about the divine feminine, the divine masculine, but also about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And I was wondering if we could start out by having you talk a little bit about both what you talk about in the book, but also perhaps to those of people who haven't read the book, explain a little bit about what the book is about and how it came about.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Well, like a lot of people, I was raised traditionally Christian. My dad was Baptist, my mom was Methodist, and we all became Episcopalian. I'm not kidding. I was confirmed Episcopalian when I was 13 years old, and I really love that. It's like Catholic light, you've got all the beautiful rituals and the gorgeous cathedrals and the beautiful music and the incense, but none of the guilt, which is a really good thing. We should leave that behind. And but like a lot of people, I always really loved Jesus from the time I was young, but I couldn't reconcile what I was hearing in sometimes the churches, especially kind of more the Protestant like Baptist, which it was hellfire and damnation and judgment and punishment and guilt. I couldn't reconcile this with the God that Jesus presented, which was unconditional love and forgiveness and do unto others as you would want to be done to. And so something about that didn't really seem to make sense to me. And of course, it's the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, and kind of the way they explained it was in the past, hey, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and judgment and punishment, but Jesus came to rewrite the law and to say the law was love. And so I was like, okay, but I bet there's more to the story than that, and I always really wanted to know about his secret teachings, because as I grew up and I began to study this, I became aware that there were a lot of books that we now know from the Nag Hammadi text and the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947 and 1945, actually flipped dates, 1945 and 1947, that actually present a whole lot of other gospels written by Mary Magdalene, by Thomas, by Philip, by Judas, and so forth. And of course, then we came to realize that basically what we know as the New Testament was a codification around 312 AD by the Emperor Constantine, who of course had inherited a lot of problems. You know, there was a period of time when the Christians were very oppressed and they were killed, and Nero's time and Caligula's, where they were fed to the lions in the ring. And then of course Constantine was trying to look at a bigger picture. He was the head of the Mithran sect called Sol Invictus. And Sol means sun, of course, so victorious sun, that's what it represented. And they honored another earlier incarnation of one of these great solar lords who was said to have been born on December 25th as Osiris in Egypt and Horus in Egypt, and later Jesus was said to be born, because they were all being honored really as the return of the solar light, the light of the world, the saviors of illumination that come to change the world and change the planet. And so, you know, he brought together Christians and Jews that believed in Jesus, and said, okay, let's come up with something that works for everybody, so we stop all these religious wars. And they codified it into what we think of as the New Testament, and they chose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those were the four that they chose. But you know, of the, I think I can't quite remember because it's been a few years since I've written the Jesus book, but I think there are 33 or 27 books, I think, of the New Testament, and the majority are actually written by Paul. And Paul, you know, didn't even know Jesus, although he did have that big encounter on the road to Damascus, and he was a Roman citizen, so he was largely responsible for being a force within the Roman Empire that was allowed to teach Christianity and begin that movement. But of course, his information was very much secondhand. Yeah. And so all this is something that I began to uncover and discover, but I was always looking for Jesus' secret teachings. Yeah. And I always kind of wanted to know about Mary Magdalene, and I wanted to know about Mary the Mother. And, you know, if there were these empowered divine male energies, were there also complementary energies, female energies? And when we look back in a lot of the great world religions, for example, the Hindu path, we find that many times there are the male and the female. For example, in the Ramayana, Rama, the Lord Rama, said to be an incarnation of Vishnu, or the divine of God, comes in with his female counterpart Sita. In the Mahabharata, Krishna, said to be the same kind of incarnation, comes in with his divine counterpart Radha. And when we look even at the Hindu gods of Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer, they come in with like Lakshmi and Parvati and Shakti, for certainly for the Shakti Kali energy, which is the feminine for that Shiva, transformer, destroyer energy. And so, you know, when we look even at St. Francis of Assisi, this incredibly sainted being from the 1200s, he had Claire. So here we have Mary Magdalene, who was Jesus himself called the apostle of apostles, the one who knew the all. And yet we see in the Roman Catholic version of Christianity that developed over many, many centuries of political agendas and financial agendas, we see that Mary Magdalene got marginalized. And this happened around 591 AD by Pope Gregory I, who in his 33 homily actually said, my brothers, where did, you know, she get that expensive spikenard that she anointed his hands and feet and head? Yeah. She must have gotten it through forbidden acts of the flesh. Yeah. And so this is total conjecture, total projection, totally made up, based on nothing. Yeah. And from this, of course, you know, then it began, well, forbidden acts of the flesh, maybe she was a prostitute. And then we have 1,500 years of character defamation. Now, the Catholic Church took all that back in 1979. They retracted that, very nice of them, after 1,500 years of trashing poor little Mary Magdalene's name. And, you know, now we're at a place where we're beginning to ask, well, who really was she? And the work of writers like Dan Brown with the Da Vinci Code, finally brought to light this sort of hidden secret that it seemed that the Knights Templars had, where they honored the masculine and feminine. The Cathars had. These were very earlier sects of Christianity that came up around the 1100s and the 1200s that were a little disgusted with the way that the Catholic Church had become so militaristic, so political, also so financial, where people could go and rape and steal and pillage other people's lands, and then be exonerated by the church by paying indulgences or money to the church to kind of excuse their sins. And wine was being sold. I mean, the Pope Innocents, they literally had brothels where they had enslaved women for sexual prostitution, and they called them Magdalenes. I mean, total defamation. And they would go use them themselves, and then they'd take the money from the brothels and use them for themselves. So the poor women were completely suppressed. And so, this was all a big revelation to me, as you can imagine. And as you know, in the Divine Sophia book, I was about 27 when I first began to even understand that there was an aspect of the divine that was considered the Divine Mother. Like everyone else, I had been raised to believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. That means God's a male, although everybody can notice that men never actually give birth. It's the female of every species that gives birth. So actually, when we think about it logically, with that as above, so below, it doesn't make much sense. And this is why for tens of thousands of years, the people of the world believed that who had created the universe was the Divine Mother, because they could observe that in nature, she is the principle that gives birth to everything. And then over time, it became the Divine Father and Mother. And that's also very beautiful because, it does take a mom and a dad coming together and hopefully in love in order to produce a child. And there is an aspect of the divine that is probably beyond any gender or sexuality, that is both the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and they're both quite beautiful. And so as long as that was held, then everything went well on the planet. And during that period of time, when it was the Divine Mother and Father, there were no wars. There were no wars. Men and women ruled together in a partnership model. Men had their place, women had their place, they worked together, and there was no violence or wars. And so this is unbelievable, actually, when we consider what we've inherited in our patriarchal religions. And then it kind of moved to where it was the Divine Father and Mother, and then the Divine Father, Mother, Daughter, and Son. And the Son, the early forerunner of Jesus, was a Mesopotamian god called Tammuz. And very much like Jesus, he was considered one who loved his people. He was willing to give his life for the good of his people. And every Easter, every spring, there was an official Easter there, and it was called Oster or Ostara. It was dedicated to the Divine Mother of the cosmic egg that had created the universe. But there would be these rituals enacted where the purest and most worthy of men in the tribe, they would compete for this honor, and one would be chosen, and they would ritually go into the cave and be dead for 3 days and 3 nights. And of course the queen, high priestess, would come and anoint his body, and all the people would wail and, grieve and so forth. And of course, he wasn't really dead. It was a play. And then at the end of 3 days, he came back to life, and everyone rejoiced, and spring had risen and new life had come to the earth. And this was a really great ceremony, because it honored the purity of men to love the earth and to love the people enough to give their lives, which of course is what Jesus literally did. And so this was known all throughout the ancient world, from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean to Egypt and so forth. A very similar thing was true with Osiris, the celebration of the sacrifice of Osiris for the good of the people in Egypt. And so this is not in any way to undercut Jesus or the importance of what he did.
This has been the latest one.
Yes, and of course he actually did it for real. I mean, he wasn't play acting. He was like doing the real thing. And so In my book about Return of the Divine Sophia, as you know, it begins with a tale, and it's a true tale, which is my tale, about how I was contacted in the dream state by the Priestesses of Isis, and I had no idea who the Priestesses of Isis were. I mean, is this some strange Egyptian cult or something? But I actually had this very powerful lucid dream that I'd gone back to school to get my master's degree, which is kind of funny because we all seek to become a spiritual master, so I'm sure that's what that was about. And I woke up in the dorm room, and there was all this extraterrestrial writing and symbols on the walls, and I tried to remember it, but I fell back asleep, and when I woke up, of course, the writing was gone. So I could only remember one symbol, which was a circle with a dot at the center. And somehow I knew this meant the beginning of all things and the ending of all things, but I had no idea how I could possibly know that. And of course, later I was to discover that this is the symbol for the sun. It's also the one that's used in physics to represent the singularity, which is a simple scientific way to say God, the one and only, and the event horizon, which is a way to say everything that God creates, okay? And but in the time I had this dream, in 27, I knew nothing like this. And then I wound up going to the library to see if I could find some reference to that symbol. And while I was there, the student assistant came to get me and said, there is a phone call for you at the front desk. And I'm like, for me? I mean, nobody even knows I'm here. So I went to the phone and was like, hello, who's this? And they said, is this Trisha McCannon? And I said, yes, who's this? And they said, we've called to tell you that your dream is real. And I'm like, who is this exactly? And they said, we're from the Priestesses of Isis, and that's all we're permitted to tell you at this time. And then they hung up. And then I woke up, and it was a dream within a dream, and we had two clues, the symbol and the Priestesses of Isis. And this is, of course, how the book starts. This is the first 3 pages of the Return of the Divine Sophia. And so, as you know, because you've read the book, my journey really began about 2 months later when I wound up going into this beautiful gift store called Illumina, and I was looking at this Egyptian statue and thinking about my dream, and the woman behind the counter said, are you interested in Egyptian things? And I was like, well, yeah, I'm dreaming of the Priestesses of Isis. And she said, well, tell me your dreams. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure I even understand my dreams. I'm not sure why you'd understand them. I mean, she's a clerk, for heaven's sakes. And she said, try me. I'm a hierophant, meaning a high initiate in the Priestesses of Isis. And this was to become my shaman teacher. And as you know, in the 2nd chapter, I go and spend the day with her. And the things she said to me completely upended my world. I mean, it was so profound and so life-changing, her perspective on things. For example, I never knew that all mammals, humans included, are created biologically female first. And that the existence of the male is because the release of an additional androgen that then allows the male to form. So in other words, the male is actually a biological subset of the female, which of course was totally different from how I had been raised, which was that, you know, Adam was created first, then he was lonely, so he got put to sleep, and there was a rib taken, and they formed Eve as his companion. And this is, of course, the justification that the patriarchy has used for centuries to say, we're the dominant species, and we have the command over all the women, and you must, you know, have sex with us and have our children and not work, and you're our slaves, okay? And in the first place, I don't know what gives one half of the population, the world, the right to enslave the other half, whether it's women enslaving men or men enslaving women, blacks enslaving whites or whites enslaving red people enslaving yellow people or yellow people enslaving green people. I mean, it's not right. We're all souls. We all come in for the experience of learning in this lifetime, and all souls should be given the chance that, as they say in America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And does it always happen in America? No, it's, you know, not ideal. It's an experiment in statesmanship, and we do well sometimes in some presidential reigns, and we do very badly in others, as the world probably clearly knows at this point with Donald Trump in charge. But it is an experiment that we are working to try to create for some kind of justice and fairness in the world, whether it's for men or women or races or cultures or religions or nationalities. And so this was a huge wake-up call for me, and as you know in the book, I'm a scaredy cat when this happens, and it's clear to me my guides want me to study with her, but frankly, I came from a very conservative family, and I was already meditating and, a student of the great spiritual mysteries and the Egyptian mysteries and many other things. So I was already out on the limb from the point of view of my family. And so I thought, oh my God, if I go down this path, they'll think I'm a witch or something. I'm not, I swear. And so I said, well, at the end of that day, I'm not ready yet, but it's clear my guides want for me to study with you. So when I am ready, will you me? And she gave me her word. And so, as you know, in the book, 5 years pass, and there are many things that bring me back to her, but eventually I do begin to study with her, and it opened up this whole world of understanding about the many archetypes of the divine feminine that were known in the ancient world. Yeah. In our Christian world, we basically have had the obedient Mary, the poor little penitent, blamed, sullied Mary Magdalene, or their version of her. Yeah. We've had Eve, who was to blame for everything because she ate that darn apple. Although Adam also ate the apple, clearly, but she, he didn't get any blame. She got all the blame. Yeah. We have poor little Lilith, who was actually a Christed aspect that came in with an earlier aspect of the soul that was Jesus about 100,000 years ago. But Lilith got demonized as the disobedient wife that wouldn't lay in the missionary position. And so, the Jews even painted her with horns and, a tail like the devil. Because it was all about, if you won't obey, you're going to be demonized. And that's basically what they were doing. It was all a PR campaign. Yeah. So, what have our archetypes been? Be a whore or be a virgin. That's terrible. Yeah. So when we look back at the ancient world, we discover that women were healers and teachers and warriors and statesmen and wisdom keepers, and they were creators of dance and music and the arts, and of the arts of civilization, of knowledge, and they represented fairness and kindness and exploration and wisdom. And so the study of the goddess, in many ways, in my opinion, is about reawakening these positive archetypes in women today, in girls today, in the world today, to bring the world back into balance, so that the divine feminine and the divine masculine come back into a place of partnership, and we can end this crazy cycle of destruction and persecution and victimization that most of the world has been caught up in for about 4,000 years. Okay, and that's a long cycle to break.
Can I ask you, because the way I see it as if it is actually the shadow aspects of the divine masculine, or not the divine, but the shadow masculine aspects that have kind of taken over, because he has not given space or place for the divine feminine to join. And when I say join, I don't mean externally. I mean basically we ourselves as one person or one human being or one soul, or in our human expression, have not allowed both the divine feminine and the divine masculine to exist within us. And as we have suppressed those things within us, or have had tragedies happen, of course, the shadow aspects of that have surged forward. How do you? Because I know that with Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the divine feminine and the divine masculine, it becomes very apparent, but it's not necessarily that you have to have a partner. It's also, you're also able to create that union within yourself.
Yes, I totally agree.
How do you see that? Or
I think that's very well said about the shadow. As you know, in my book, I talk about several concepts. One is the idea the positive masculine, because there is a very, very beautiful aspect of the divine masculine, and we see it in all sorts of leaders and heroes and statesmen and saviors and avatars and so forth, and we love that part. The goddess would be very lonely without her divine masculine. And so I'm a great advocate for the divine masculine as well as the divine feminine. And believe me, if women were being horrible and beating up on men, I've been the first to stand up for them. So we have that positive masculine and we have that positive feminine, and they are different, but they're close together. And then we have a negative masculine and we have a negative feminine. And what happens is when the negative masculine, which is very much a tyrant and a bully, suppresses the positive feminine. In other words, the positive feminine is creative, it's kind, it's loving, it's nurturing, but it's intuitive, it's magical, it wants to create, whether it's painting or drawing or creating a business or creating a family or creating a home. That part is suppressed by the negative masculine. What happens is, women are not allowed to hold jobs. They're not allowed to have their voices heard. They're not allowed to have businesses. They're not allowed to do anything except basically become sex slaves and food slaves for the men to come home to raise the men's kids so that the male seed can be passed down through the generations. It's crazy. It's so ego-based. So what happens is then the woman has no power. She's lost all power to express who she is. So she moves over then to the negative feminine. And the negative feminine, we can see it. It's manipulative, it's passive aggressive, it's seductive, and twisting men around their little finger. It's the misuse of sexual energy, because in truth it's the last thing she has. I mean, when we say what do men want from women, a positive masculine man says, I want companionship, intimacy, conversation, creativity, adventure, exploration, love, sharing. These are all the same things that a positive feminine wants from her man. These guys want everything together, and that's the world we're hoping to create. But what does a negative masculine want from a woman? Obedience, sex, food. The lower reptilian brain, which is feeding, fighting, fornicating, and fleeing, okay? And so what he does is he beats her into submission, or he dominates her into submission, and the only power she has is, really his desire for sex or food, okay? And it's lower reptilian brain thinking and lower chakra thinking. So we have to let this part in men transform to where men can begin to claim more of their own positive masculine, and at the same time allow women to claim more of their positive feminine. And this actually has been happening. We see it happening throughout Europe, we see it happening throughout the Americas, thank goodness, and it's been kind of really going on for at least the last 100 years. But when we look at the Middle East, bless the hearts of a lot of those wonderful women over there that really don't have a choice. And now some of them might be totally happy raising their kids and making food and waiting for their husbands to come home. And some of them, actually, I've been to many of those countries, and there's some incredibly intelligent, well-educated women. But once that negative patriarchy comes in, that the women don't have an opportunity to be the doctor, to be the lawyer, to be the statesman, to have their own business, because they're once again relegated to service, for the man. And I think this is part of what has to change, not only in our societies, but as you just pointed out, in ourselves. We have to bring the divine feminine up. And there are some people we know that have the feminine going, but they don't have the masculine. And that's also out of balance. We all know people who are fun, creative, but they're kind of spacey, and they're not very responsible, and they're not very grounded. They're fun to be around. We just love them. But we would say they're only kind of like in their heart up and not grounded. They need the masculine to ground and to be more responsible. If you have the masculine, he's being responsible. He's patrolling the fort, okay? And any danger, he gets out his gun and shoots it. He's really organizing that fort very well, though, in a very efficient way. But guess what? He's not open to new ideas. He's not really creative, except maybe about war. Okay, how can we solve the war problems or the food shortage problems? but he's not, being intuitive, loving, kind. He's not being open to new opportunities. He's not seeing a new vision because he can only operate within the known parameters. And so this is what is called whole brain thinking.
I suppose that's what we see in both men or women, because I reading your book and going through the text or the chapters where this occurred, I had a very vivid reaction to it, because I could finally see how I had been the negative masculine in both my work life and my private life or personal life. And I could see, and for me, it became kind of like a blueprint for, okay, so this is where that, I was off here. This is where I'm off. So it's actually a tool where you and once you're able to, as you say, marry those two or combine those two, you're able to, pinpoint where am I off, then you're also able to raise whether it be the positive feminine or the positive masculine. It's just to say that, again, that it's not really to do with, as far as I understand it, to do with gender, but it's more to do with those polarities within ourselves.
And you're absolutely right. Women can, because the only model for power women have had for many hundreds of years is the masculine model. Yes. So when women came into power, for example, in the women's lib movement, what were they? They were angry. Okay. They were dominating. Yeah. They were, pissed off basically. And, it's understandable. It's the pendulum swinging, but their models, even going into the corporate world, were to compete with the men with the male model. Yeah. The truth is that you can be negative masculine even if you're a woman. Yeah. And you can also be, there are men that are passive aggressive, can't balance their checkbooks, expect someone to take care of them, be, and there are men that can be negative feminine. Yeah. So it's not really about the gender of the body. It's about trying to find an interior balance. And there's so many things, you said the sacred marriage. That is so right. There's many levels to what the sacred marriage is. Yeah. But definitely one of the core ones is the activation of the left and right hemispheres, the masculine and feminine, the logical and the intuitive, the grounded and the creative, that come together and allow us to live a balanced life, create a more balanced family, create a more balanced society, where we can come up with creative solutions that don't have to involve murder, killing, and violence, and the raping and the pillaging of the land, and the people and the children and the animals. We can come up with creative ways if we're on that page. And what Jesus talked about in the Gospel of Thomas is the next level of that sacred marriage. And that is, he says, when you make the two eyes into one, the third eye, the inner life into the outer life, the outer life as a reflection of the inner life, the male brain into the female brain, and then you shall see the kingdom of heaven. So when that happens, we open our third eye and we begin to gain access into the divine dimensions or worlds of light beyond this physical one. And we can do it through meditation, we can do it through dreams, we can do it through visions, but the only way this happens is for these two aspects of who we are to be in that sacred marriage.
And it really is a beautiful place. And it's also it's about creating, the way I see it is, when you have that marriage, it's about creating, it becomes about unity, it becomes about peace, and it becomes about love. And rarely do I see, like, these, when we are, based in both our divine feminine and divine masculine, our service or who we are really becomes about the whole, like serving the whole and not just ourselves. It takes it to another level. The way you spoke about Mary Magdalene and how she's been seen, and actually how the church, the Catholic Church, has actually retracted her, the way they saw her or the history of her.
And I want to say bravo to the church for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was done under Pope Paul. And, as with any organization, whether it's the presidency of the United States or the Catholic Church. You've had more enlightened leaders, and the Catholic Church has had some wonderful ones like Pope Paul, and Pope Francis seems pretty good. And they've had others that really have been more political or more agenda-driven that had nothing to do with that real Christed energy. And so, you know, it takes a lot of courage for any organization of any sort, particularly religious one that's supposed to be right and the Pope's supposed to be God's representative on earth, to have the courage to say, you know, so sorry, we made a mistake and we were misguided. And so I really want to acknowledge the courage that it took for those more enlightened individuals who are involved in the church to say that. And so bravo.
Because it's way easy. I mean, I think as a human being, we all know it's probably way easier to hate than it is to love. It's way easier to lash out at someone if we were being attacked. It's way easier to choose,
defensiveness or offensiveness.
To lash back rather than choosing love and being in that.
It's a challenge, you know. We were talking about that a little earlier, and you know, sometimes you have to write all the angry letters to get all those feelings out in order to get to this part of you that realizes that it's more than just at this moment, that when we continue to play that victim persecutor game, we actually become more and more entangled in the karma. And if we don't resolve it in this lifetime, we will have to deal with it in the next. And so if you just think about it from the idea of spiritual liberation in this lifetime, which the ancients call Jivan Murti, you have to really try to, work through all those complex emotions to get to the point of saying, what could this situation teach me? It doesn't mean that the other person was necessarily right or that you're necessarily wrong, but what can I learn from this? And this is another person. They're someplace on the arc of their lessons. Maybe in some ways they're more aware than us, and in other ways they're remedial and way behind us. But how can I treat them with the greatest amount of compassion and understanding? It's to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's easier said than done. And every day we get to practice.
Absolutely. And every day, I don't know every day, but we also get to fail and get to, get to try and do it over.
And that's why spiritual community is so important. Okay, I really think that's one of the major reasons. And of course, the internet is giving us a different kind of spiritual community. And what you're doing with these Magdalene interviews is, in the past, we went to church for a spiritual community, and sometimes there is a great fellowship there. But there are other kinds of spiritual community. And as some of this dogma and hellfire and damnation, guilt, shame, blame thing falls away, we can start looking at it from a different perspective and still honor those great spiritual teachers that have come to bring us these lessons in such a pure form. That's one of the things I really love about Jesus.
And I also want to point out that it's not about suppressing anything. So when he says do unto others as you would do, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you, it's also because very often spiritual communities or spiritual people get flagged for ignoring or suppressing, and I find that it's not about suppressing. There's a difference for me between ignoring and denying. Ignoring something will have it come back in your face, but while if you deny it, you actually have the ability to acknowledge that it's there, but denied any effect over you. And so you're not suppressing it or in any way. And I would never suggest that anyone suppresses anything. If it's anger that comes up, as you said, ask yourself, how will it serve me? Will it serve me to get angry? Because I think that we all do that.
Right. Well, we are very complex, and we have multi-layers of emotions. And, even spiritual people, for example, that know, for example, that when someone dies and goes to the other side, that their loved one is in a better place, we still have to deal with our emotions around their loss and our, and this is the same thing even with a love relationship. You love the other person, but for whatever reason, you can't make it work. You let them go for the betterment of both of you, but there's still the grief piece. And so because we are so complex, many times when we do have hurt or wounding or anger, it's best to try to journal it out, okay? When I've actually been angry with somebody, I'll usually write 3 letters. There's the furious letter, which they never get to see. And then, of course, then there's the peaceful kind of contrite, I'm so sorry, I'm so sad letter. And then I'm able to finally write the letter that I really mean, which is these many voices coming together. But it is a process. And in that last letter, I always try to return to forgiveness and compassion, and also taking a look at what I can learn from it, and what the other person, even though they might seem like a thorn in our side, actually has been put in our lives to remind us of, or to catalyze us towards. And that's a really important piece. We were talking about this earlier. I have very traditional older sister, and she's I think she's probably had lifetimes as an Amish person or a Puritan in past lives. She's actually very good and very moral, but her spiritual understanding is, I'd say, less universal than mine. That's how I would couch it. She's sort of in the hellfire damnation, judgment of God camp. And so, and she's married to a preacher, and that kind of makes it even worse. Okay. And so, despite the fact that I love her and I see all of her good qualities, she drives me crazy a lot of times, and she probably thinks I drive her crazy. And so, but I have to honor the fact that when we were up there in heaven, and we decided that we were all going to come into the same family, that she signed up to have me as her sister, maybe for me to open up a more universal way of thinking for her. But what did she do for me? She catalyzed me to really look more closely at how the letter of the law of judgment doesn't really free us from the wheel of karma. It actually catches us up in a continual repeating loop, war after war after war, whether you're in the Middle East or you're in Scotland or Ireland and England, or you're Russia and America or China and Japan. I mean, it just keeps us in this it keeps us stuck, okay? And so that is not what Jesus intended. What his teachings were about, in my opinion, were about the spiritual liberation. And giving us the keys for that. And in my book, Return of the Divine Sophia, as you know, I have about 4 or 5 chapters of his hidden teachings, where he talks openly about some of these deep keys for transformation. And he talks openly about the Abba, Amma, the Father, Mother God, the divine mother, father, and daughter and son, who periodically come to earth. I also have some of the lost teachings of Mary Magdalene. The Gnostic Christians, the early Christians that were closer to Jesus than any other group, captured about 250 of her sayings that are so profound, and I have many of them in my book. And most people don't even know Mary Magdalene had this wisdom that she went on to teach after the crucifixion, and that she lived in France and lived in England, and that every 3 years or so she went to Cyprus, where there was Joseph of Arimathea had an estate, and that Christians from across the Mediterranean came to that island of Cyprus for a couple of weeks, and that she would discourse in the beginning of the day, and the whole rest of the day would be open to everyone else's wisdom and insights and discussions about that subject. And most of us know nothing about all this because it got really buried under the political agenda of the church.
And it seems as though, even though the church, as you said, has retracted this, back in was it the 70s? It seems as though, and that's actually one of the reasons why I've created this show, The Magdalene Voices, is because I really want to bring about, I want to bring about awareness of Mary Magdalene and her, not only her teachings, but the voices that continue, because the Magdalenes were many, as far as I understand, and they continue throughout time and space. And it also seems as though she was while she perhaps were not the outspoken one at the time of Jesus's or public ministry, she did actually teach for many, many years, or for years after, and
And you're right about the Magdalens. You know, there was an order of Magdalens that had formed. I talk about it in the book. They had formed probably long ago in Egypt at the time when the young Horus king was coming up and had to be protected from his evil uncle Set, so he wouldn't be killed. And then that line continued when King Solomon married the Egyptian queen or princess, and she was foremost among his brides, and he had 300 wives and 600 concubines, so he was, you know, pretty busy, that boy. And then it continued, and so by the time you come down to Mary and Mary Jacobi, Mary Salome, the women who surrounded Jesus, they were part of that Magdalene order that had been awaiting the birth and the arrival of the next Horus king, or the king of light that would become the world's savior. And that movement, I think, is arising today. You and I are not the only women who are on that page. No. There are, I think, thousands of women. I'm contacted all the time by people who are honoring Gaia, the planet Earth, an expression of the feminine, Sophia, the divine wisdom, as she was known in the Jewish and the Greek teachings, Mary Magdalene, as she's finally coming out from behind the shadows, Mary the Mother, who I just wound up working with this incredible Filipino healer who works with Mary the Mother, so beautiful, the Lady of Guadalupe, who was an expression of the Divine Mother, Isis, which of course the patriarchies now turn this terrorist group that's name is really ISIL, not even ISIS, it's ISIL, into ISIS. And I think that just like the war on Terra, T-A-R-A, is, I think it's all about the patriarchy being afraid they're going to lose power. And so they're sort of trying to condition the subconscious of people to be afraid of ISIS or Terra, or the war on Terra, the war on the earth. I mean, the war on the divine feminine. And I think it's important for us to turn this around and to realize that the divine feminine is actually what we most need at this critical time in world history to change our patterns so that the divine masculine can arise to do what he does best, bring enlightenment, truth, and kindness and protection, and the divine feminine can do what she does best, which is to bring creative solutions to the world's problems that don't involve this kind of struggle, war, and death.
Do you have, because again, I know I've said this a couple of times, I really want to say it because I don't know where they're from, but I have vivid, memories of being torn, like a priestess being torn by the patriarchy. So I can completely understand why the patriarchy will fight so hard not to lose their control and their power, because it seems frightening that you will be put to sleep or to death by someone and have lose all power and control. So I have a very deep compassion for the patriarchy who's going through this, because it's not necessarily the best or the nicest of the experiences. However, I also, as you also mentioned earlier, I think it's very important that we don't fall into the feminist camp and saying, like you said, that the only expression we know of a great leader is an angry, hateful, vengeful leader, and that's not the way to go either, whether you're male or female. But that was not my question. My question is, do you because it seems as though the divine feminine is awakening in women all over across the world, and I believe she's awakening in men as well. But do you have do you know, or do you have an idea of why it is that it's so strong in women when we all carry both the divine feminine and the divine masculine within ourselves? Why is it that she's calling to women? So.
Well, I mean, I just think that, I think the Dalai Lama said it's going to be the women of the world that are going to save this planet. And he's right. And there are fabulous men that are awakening and coming online. And actually, there have always been fabulous men. If you look at those Knights Templars, you look at the Cathars, you look at some of these groups that were real champions, that were defending the divine feminine. You look at King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, 13 knights, that's the number of the divine feminine, looking for the Holy Grail that some believe was not just the cup, but was actually the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We have always had fabulous men out there.
Yeah.
And the more of those we can have, that will help to turn this. And so this is what's so important in our dialoguing about this, to not say, oh, it's all the men's fault. The truth is, the men of the world have inherited their systems the same way the women of the world have. And it's up to both groups to say, what isn't working about this program? You know, is this actually fair? Would I want to be treated the way that the women of the world are being treated? Would I want to be raped? Would I want to, I mean, in America, 50% of all women that are killed by their husbands or their boyfriends. And this is in the, you know, land of the free and the home of the brave. You know, we don't know what the statistics are in the Middle East, but I'm sure they're a whole lot worse. So that control by the negative masculine of fear does not really work. It works for maybe a limited period of time, fear and violence, but it's not going to create an enlightened world. It's not going to create a happy world, and it's not going to help us. And we are now moving into an age where balance and that partnership model is really what we need to be walking and talking. You know, the greatest women in the world would be very lonely without their men, and men would certainly be very lonely without their women. So, it's my hope that if people want to know more about my work, they can go to my website. I know we've gone a little longer than we intended, and I hope we get to do some more of these. But if people want to find out about me, my website is www.TrishaMcCannonspeaks.com, and that's TRICIAMCCANNON speaks, or TrishaMcCannon.com. And I hope that we get to do other interviews.
I'll be sure to both for the beneath this video, basically there'll be, you know,
that sounds great. Links,
books and all of that, and that we've spoken about. So I want to conclude by saying thank you so much for your time, Tricia.
My pleasure, Maria. What a pleasure, and Goddess bless.
Goddess bless you. Take care. Bye-bye. That is what I had for you today in this, our very first show of the Magdalene Voices. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed creating it for you, and I look forward to sharing many more upcoming episodes with you. I do hope that you will take the time to either comment, share, or like this video or podcast wherever you may be. If you're listening to this via podcast, go to my website, Mariaestela.com, to get all of the links that we have spoken about in this episode. While there, make sure to subscribe to my newsletter, My Sacred Circle, so that you will get notified whenever a new episode goes live. Thanks again for listening. Take care.